The light on the phone stopped blinking. That was wrong. He stared at it from across the room, unmoving, letting the silence stretch. No vibration, no hum, no delayed notification trying to catch up. Just a dark screen and the low sound of the building settling into the night. Someone had chosen not to respond. Not forgotten, not missed it. Chosen. He didn't reach for the phone. He didn't pace. He didn't check the time. He already knew what that silence meant. And knowing was worse than confirmation. Because this wasn't a mistake. It was a test. And someone, somewhere, believed they were invisible while failing it. Outside, the city exhaled. Distant traffic, a siren far enough away to feel irrelevant. The world continuing without awareness that a line had just been crossed. He remained where he was, listening, waiting for the feeling to arrive. It did. Not anger. Disappointment. That quiet, heavy realization that the thing you built to protect yourself had started attracting the very weakness you despised. He finally picked up the phone and turned it face down on the table. No response was a response. And now, the waiting would begin. If you're listening right now, notice where you are, the room, the time of night. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Stories like this unfold differently depending on when you hear them. He didn't always test loyalty. Once, he believed it showed itself naturally, that people stayed because they believed, because they respected what he was building, because they understood the weight of being trusted. That belief didn't survive success. Success brought proximity. Proximity brought interest. Interest brought people who smiled too easily and agreed too quickly. People who said the right things without understanding why they mattered. So he started watching instead of asking. Small things at first. Who arrived early without being reminded? Who stayed after meetings ended? Who spoke when silence was safer? Loyalty didn't announce itself. It revealed itself in inconvenience. The tests were never dramatic, never obvious. No one was asked to choose sides or make declarations. That was childish, loud. He preferred quiet pressure, a delayed call, a shifted responsibility, an opportunity that required patience instead of reward. Most passed without knowing they'd been tested at all. The ones who noticed were the ones who failed. He sat alone at a long table one evening, plates untouched, listening to the hum of electricity in the walls. The building was full, yet he felt oddly separate from it, like he was observing his own life from behind glass. Control had done that. It simplified things, reduced uncertainty, removed the chaos of relying on others. But control also attracted people who mistook access for importance. Those were the most dangerous ones. He remembered the first time he realized someone close to him didn't understand the rules. They had asked for reassurance, not quietly, publicly, as if loyalty needed to be affirmed out loud. It didn't. Loyalty was demonstrated when reassurance was not required. That person didn't last long. Now, years later, the stakes were higher and the masks were better. People learned what expressions to wear, how to mirror concern, how to perform patience. But performance cracked under pressure. It always did. The unanswered message was intentional. He knew that now. It wasn't defiance, it was calculation. Someone believed the balance had shifted, that silence was safer than response. That belief interested him. The next day, he said nothing. He went through meetings as usual, listened, nodded, asked a few questions that seemed unrelated. He watched how information traveled, where it slowed, where it changed tone. Silence moved faster than truth. By afternoon, two people were acting differently. One spoke less, another spoke more than necessary. Overcompensation and withdrawal, both signs of the same thing: uncertainty. He introduced another test without announcing it: a rumor. Not false, just incomplete. He let it drift, uncorrected, and watched who tried to fill in the gaps, who asked privately, who spread it publicly, who pretended not to notice it at all. By nightfall, the shape of the problem was clearer. Someone believed loyalty was a transaction. They were wrong. He walked home alone that night, choosing streets that forced him to slow down. The city felt colder than usual, not in temperature, but in awareness. Neon lights flickered. Storefronts reflected a version of him that looked composed and untouched. He wondered when that reflection had stopped being accurate. Power had sharpened him. It had also hollowed him. Late that night, he sat in the dark again, phone untouched, waiting to see if the silence would break. It didn't. That confirmed everything. The next phase began quietly. Responsibilities were reassigned, not stripped away, shifted. Authority diluted without explanation. Access narrowed without announcement. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm, just enough to create discomfort. He watched the discomfort spread. Questions went unasked. Assumptions replaced clarity. People began comparing notes without realizing they were doing it. That was the point. Loyalty tests worked best when people didn't realize they were being measured against each other. One person finally reached out. Not the one who had gone silent, another. They spoke carefully, too carefully, asking questions framed as concern, expressing loyalty without offering proof. He listened and said little. When the call ended, he felt tired. Not physically, morally. Testing people took something out of him. It required distance, calculation, a willingness to see others as variables instead of individuals. But what was the alternative? Trust had limits. Unchecked trust was expensive. That night he dreamed of a time before any of this mattered, before rooms were quiet because people were afraid to speak, before silence felt like a weapon instead of rest. He woke before dawn, the dream already fading. By the end of the week, the person who had grown silent made a move, not against him, away from him, subtle, strategic, an attempt to reposition without confrontation. That was the failure. They were wrong. He walked home alone that night, choosing streets that forced him to slow down. The city felt colder than usual, not in temperature, but in awareness. Neon lights flickered. Storefronts reflected a version of him that looked composed and untouched. He wondered when that reflection had stopped being accurate. Power had sharpened him. It had also hollowed him. Late that night, he sat in the dark again, phone untouched, waiting to see if the silence would break. It didn't. That confirmed everything. The next phase began quietly. Responsibilities were reassigned, not stripped away, shifted. Authority diluted without explanation. Access narrowed without announcement. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm, just enough to create discomfort. He watched the discomfort spread. Questions went unasked, assumptions replaced clarity. People began comparing notes without realizing they were doing it. That was the point. Loyalty tests worked best when people didn't realize they were being measured against each other. One person finally reached out. Not the one who had gone silent, another. They spoke carefully, too carefully, asking questions framed as concern, expressing loyalty without offering proof. He listened and said little. When the call ended, he felt tired. Not physically, morally. Testing people took something out of him. It required distance, calculation, a willingness to see others as variables instead of individuals. But what was the alternative? Trust had limits. Unchecked trust was expensive. That night he dreamed of a time before any of this mattered, before rooms were quiet because people were afraid to speak, before silence felt like a weapon instead of rest. He woke before dawn, the dream already fading. By the end of the week, the person who had grown silent made a move, not against him, away from him, subtle, strategic, an attempt to reposition without confrontation. That was the failure. Loyalty wasn't about staying close. It was about staying aligned. And alignment didn't drift accidentally. He didn't stop them. He let the move happen. That was the final test. When the move failed, quietly, predictably, the realization arrived too late. By then, doors had closed without sound. Support had evaporated without explanation. The person found themselves standing alone, unsure when the ground had shifted beneath them. He never confronted them. He didn't need to. Failure had already done the work. What surprised him wasn't the outcome, it was how little satisfaction it brought. Watching someone fail a loyalty test didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation of something he'd been avoiding, that the more power he accumulated, the fewer people actually knew him. They knew his reach, they knew his influence, they didn't know him, and maybe they never had. The isolation settled in slowly after that, not as loneliness. Loneliness implied longing. This was different. This was absence without desire. He had people around him constantly, yet no one to speak to freely. Every word felt measured, every pause interpreted. Even silence felt performative now. He began spending more time alone, not because he wanted to, but because it was easier. Alone, he didn't have to test anyone. He sat by a window one evening, watching rain blur the city into streaks of light, thinking about how loyalty used to feel warm, human, messy. Now it felt clinical, like a system. And systems didn't care who you were once they were built. The collapse didn't come suddenly. It never does. It came as exhaustion, as the realization that maintaining control required constant vigilance, that every relationship was provisional, that every interaction carried weight. Power hadn't freed him, it had obligated him. He understood, finally, that loyalty tests didn't strengthen bonds.
They revealed how few bonds were real to begin with. Late one night, he turned off his phone and left it that way, not as a test, not as a tactic, as relief. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't threatening, it was honest. He sat with it until dawn, letting the city wake up without him, letting the system run without his input. For the first time in a long while, he he didn't feel in control, and, strangely, that felt lighter. The tests had failed them, but they had failed him, because in proving who couldn't be trusted, he had proven something else just as clearly, that he had built a world where loyalty had no room to breathe. The morning light filled the room slowly, revealing nothing new, just a man sitting quietly, surrounded by everything he'd worked for, finally understanding what it had cost. If stories like this stay with you, if they linger after the silence, subscribe, and in the comments, share the moment that stood out to you most and where you're watching from. Some lessons sound different depending on who's listening. The room stayed dark longer than it should have. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hum of electricity behind the walls and the slow tick of a watch that didn't belong to anyone in particular. He sat still, hands folded, eyes open, waiting. Someone was late, and lateness tonight meant something else entirely. A chair creaked somewhere behind him, not close, not far enough. He didn't turn around, because if he turned, it would mean he already knew who had failed, and he wasn't ready to admit that yet. There are moments when power doesn't feel loud. It feels quiet, heavy, like the air right before a storm breaks, when everything knows what's coming, but no one moves. If you're listening to this right now, take a second. Notice where you are, what time it is, the place you're hearing this from. Drop it in the comments if you want. Not because it matters to me, but because moments like this feel less lonely when we share them. The man in the chair believed loyalty was simple.
Not because he was naive, because he had tested it for years. He believed loyalty could be measured, observed, engineered. People thought he bought it with money, with favors, with access. They were wrong. Money only showed who arrived early. Power only showed who bowed. But loyalty revealed itself in hesitation, in silence, in what people did when they thought no one was watching. The tests were never announced. They never looked like tests. A delayed payment, a rumor placed carefully into the wrong ear, a door left unlocked, a name mentioned once, then never again. Most never noticed they were being tested at all, and those were the most dangerous ones. The building he controlled didn't look impressive from the outside. No glass towers, no shining lights, just concrete that had learned how to disappear into the night. Inside, everything echoed. Footsteps felt louder than they should have. Breathing felt like a confession. He designed it that way. He believed people revealed their true selves when they felt small. Early on, loyalty came easily. People wanted to belong to something that felt inevitable. They mistook proximity for protection. But inevitability breeds arrogance, and arrogance always leaks. It started with a look, a glance held too long, a smile that arrived a second late. Nothing you could accuse someone of, nothing that justified confrontation, but enough to mark them. The first test was simple. He stopped calling, not cutting them off, not punishing them, just silence. Some reached out within days. Their messages carried panic disguised as respect. Others waited. They told themselves silence was temporary, that power always returned to those who mattered. Those names went onto different lists. He learned something important then. Loyalty isn't proven by obedience. It's proven by anxiety. The man began sleeping less, not because he feared betrayal, but because he feared misjudgment. What if he was wrong? What if loyalty wasn't something you could test, but only something you broke? The tests became more intricate. He asked one person to deliver a message he knew would never arrive, another to protect a secret already exposed, another to choose between convenience and discomfort. Each time he watched. The room filled with invisible threads. Who spoke to whom? Who avoided eye contact? Who suddenly became too busy? Power felt no longer like control. It felt like surveillance. And surveillance changes you. He stopped trusting the quiet. Silence no longer meant peace. It meant calculation. At night he replayed conversations in his head, paused on certain words, certain pauses. Why did that answer come so fast? Why did that one hesitate? People began to sense it. They didn't know what had changed, only that something had. Laughter became cautious. Jokes died mid-sentence. Rooms emptied faster than before. The tests were working. Too well. Because loyalty under pressure doesn't always reveal devotion. Sometimes it reveals fear. And fear looks a lot like betrayal when you're tired enough. The first real crack came quietly. A minor thing, a document misplaced, an explanation that arrived before the question. He told himself not to overreact. He told himself loyalty wasn't perfection. But the thought stayed. If they were loyal, why explain so much? That night he walked through the building alone. Lights off, hands brushing walls he'd chosen himself. Every decision he'd made lived here. Every compromise, every line crossed and justified. He wondered when control had stopped feeling empowering and started feeling necessary. Another test. This one involved choice. He presented two people with conflicting instructions, nothing illegal, nothing overt, just enough to see who clarified and who acted. One clarified immediately, the other didn't. The one who acted believed initiative was loyalty. He believed initiative without confirmation was ambition. Ambition was dangerous, because ambitious people don't wait for permission when they think they can replace you. The circle tightened. Meetings grew shorter. Words were chosen carefully. He watched people watch him. Mirrors everywhere. And still, something felt off. Not betrayal, expectation, as if they were waiting for him to make the first mistake. That realization changed everything. He wasn't testing loyalty anymore. He was performing it, showing strength, showing certainty. Because the moment doubt showed, someone would step into it. The tests stopped being about others. They became about him. Could he remain unreadable? Could he stay ahead of suspicion? Could he trust anyone long enough to stop testing? The answer revealed itself slowly. No. Power isolated him more effectively than any enemy ever could. He had built a system where trust was provisional and loyalty was conditional. And conditions expired. The silence returned. He sat in the same chair as before, same darkness, same waiting. The late arrival still hadn't come. This time, he turned around. The chair behind him was empty. Not a failure of loyalty, a failure of expectation. They hadn't betrayed him. They had simply stopped believing. And that realization hit harder than any defiance ever could. Loyalty tests don't just measure devotion, they erode it. Every test tells people you expect them to fail, and eventually they stop trying to pass. He understood it then, too late. The power he thought he held had taught everyone else how to live without him. The building felt colder, smaller. He imagined the future continuing, rooms filling without him, decisions made without his voice, loyalty transferring quietly to someone less suspicious. Not stronger, just calmer. The tests were over, not because he'd won, but because there was no one left to test. If stories like this stay with you, the quiet ones, the uncomfortable ones, consider subscribing. And if one moment lingered longer than the others, tell me which one and where you're listening from. Some silences deserve to be shared.